everyone. I can see a number of you joining. Thank you very much for joining us for our last climate crisis webinar. My name is Heather and I work with the admissions team in the science and engineering departments at the Swansea University. So this evening we have the biosciences presentation for you, and I'm joined by Miguel Lurgi, who is going to be talking about environmental change impacts on networks of ecological interactions. If you do have any questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A function, and we will come to those at the end. It can be about the topic that is being discussed, or if you have any more admissions-based questions, so entry requirements, what studying at Swansea is like, things like that, then please do feel free to ask away. I will now hand over to you, Miguel.
Cool. Thank you very much, Heather. Good evening, everyone. My name is Miguel, as Heather just said. I am what they call like a computational ecologist. I am like originally a computer engineer, and then I sort of drifted into some interest on ecological systems and how complex networks of ecological interactions work. So I started doing some work on that, and I got my PhD in 2014 from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. And then I went on to do a couple of postdocs, researching always on the topic of how different aspects of environmental change affect ecological networks and, well, some other stuff. So I went first to Australia for a few years and then to France. And I recently joined the biosciences department at Swansea University, where I started the computational ecology lab. And my research over the past 7 years has been on trying to understand how ecosystems are assembled and how can we use that knowledge to predict and to better understand the effects of environmental change, one of which, of the aspects of which is climate warming on ecosystems when you look at them from a network perspective. And why all of this is important? It's important because, as Daniel Jansen said in 1974, as quoted here in this slide, what escapes the eye is a much more insidious kind of extinction, the extinction of ecological interactions. And what this means basically is that, the climate crisis, or I would call it more environmental crisis, because it's not only about the climate change, is about many other aspects of environmental change or the environment of species, which also include the loss of habitat, the introduction of alien species, and many other different things. And even though the extinction of species is one of the most obvious signals or consequences of that, there is a much more insidious kind of thing that happens, which is the extinction of ecological interactions, which happens when species tend to not be together anymore, or for one reason or another they stop interacting. And the reason why the extinction of interactions is important is because, as we will see during this talk, the interactions between species are very important to understand the stability and the persistence of ecosystems. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about what are ecological interactions and how they can help us understand ecosystems. Then we are going to try to depict some sort of picture to understand the effects of warming and habitat loss on these ecological communities, always viewed from the point of networks of ecological interactions or species interactions. And then I'm going to try to bring together all of this knowledge that we got from warming and habitat loss into a common framework to better understand the environmental change impacts on natural communities. And then, the ultimate goal or why we scientists do this is to try to come up with like a set of rules that allow us to predict how these potential impacts can further impact ecosystems in the future. And we might talk a little bit about this towards the end of the talk. So what are ecological networks? Ecological networks are basically a collection of species and their interactions, and then the analysis of the structure that goes into that. And why are they important? They are important because even though we might think of ecosystems as random collections of species, like in this picture, that they might seem to be just hanging out together in some, in some location of the world. In reality, they have a very specific yet complex structure. Like, for example, in this picture, which is a simplified version of the North Atlantic food web. This is a marine food web in which these little names here represent species, and this set of arrows between them represent trophic interactions, which are relationships of predator and prey, of who eats whom, right? And then you can represent systems, ecosystems in this way, not only from the point of view of the trophic or the feeding relationships, but also from the point of view of, for example, plant and their animal pollinators. And you obtain representations like this, in which nodes on one part of the graph, like for example, these orange nodes here, do not interact between them, but only with plants on the other side. And this type of network have specific shapes. So basically, ever since ecologists started to study all these communities and how complex they are, scientists started asking questions of the sort of like, for example, why are there so many species, and how can they all live together in these ecosystems? And starting with the pioneering work by these guys over here in the picture, we started to understand better what are the implications of all of these things, of how many species there are and their interactions for the structuring and assembly of communities, and also for how these interactions are related to the fluctuations of populations and stability. And one of the sort of main results of that is that when you look at these systems from like a modeling or a mathematical point of view, you can infer very specific laws about how you would expect these ecosystems to behave in terms of the richness and the connectivity. So the number of species and how many interactions there are in the network, and how strong these interactions are. And when you put this together into this simple mathematical equation, you realize that ecosystems, when they surpass some type of complexity, some measure of complexity, which is this term over here, they are no longer feasible. So it's sort of a mystery why so many complex ecosystems that we see in the world can actually persist through time. And at the time of the discovery, which was back in the 1970s, Robert May actually posed this very important challenge for all ecologists, which was to identify the devious strategies that a natural system uses to increase its species and connectivity capacity without sacrificing its stability and persistence. And ever since then, ecologists have been trying to understand this. And the reason why understanding this is important is because as soon as we start losing this structure, these properties, like for example, as we will see, because of climate change or habitat loss, then we can expect the stability and the persistence of our ecosystems to be compromised. So we need to figure out ways of avoiding this if we want in any way to try to mitigate the effects of the climate crisis on our ecosystems. So one of the main sort of general patterns that have been observed in many networks is that they display this sort of degree distribution in their shape, right? So in these plots, which are called degree distributions, we have on the x-axis the number of links that a species has. And on the y-axis, we have the cumulative probability distribution of finding a species in our ecosystem with a particular number of links. So for example, all of the species will have at least one link, but only few species will have a lot of links. And in the network sort of literature, not only in ecological networks, but in many networks in general, from the network of airports across the globe to the global economies, all the way to Facebook or Instagram, all of these networks, technological, social, and ecological alike, they sort of display this same type of property or broadly similar to this. And when they do display this property, this is what it's called a scale-free degree distribution. And this is a property that has been suggested as facilitating or promoting stability and persistence in this system. So one thing that we could expect is that if networks or ecosystems, in our case, they sort of lose this property, they can start to break apart, basically. So how are different aspects of warming actually affecting this structure, and what could we expect from this, right? So in this part of the talk, I am going to talk about three main effects that warming has on ecosystems, and we are going to relate each one of these effects to their implications for the structure of those networks of ecological interactions. So one of the main effects that warming is having on species, which I'm guessing that many of you might have heard of this because it's one of the sort of most popular responses of species to warming, is the shifts in the ranges. The shift in the ranges basically means that species trying to track climate, they move their distribution or the spatial places where they are. The spatial distribution, it's shifted towards places that have more suitable climatic niches or habitats for them, right? So for example, in this example here, we are looking at the shift in the distribution of, in this case, kelp in the western coast, along the western coast of Australia. And we can see here that the kelp is moving, or well, not moving, but the range of the kelp along this coast is sort of shifting towards the south, because obviously temperatures are increasing in the northern part of the range. So all of these red colored bars represent locations where the kelp was formerly present, but is not there anymore. And the blue bars represent locations where the kelp was not found before, but has colonized recently. And here we can see how this shift has sort of affected the distribution of the species. And this sort of effect, for which the kelp is only a small example, has actually been observed across many different taxa in many different species, from mammals all the way to dragonflies, spiders, beetles, all of these species on this graph. This is results from a paper in Global Change Biology published back in 2006, where we can observe that the distribution, so on the y-axis here, we have an average shift towards the pole in kilometers by each of these different species types. So why do range shifts affect ecological interactions? Well, that is sort of easy to see, because you can imagine that a species that was not found in a previous place, it's able to colonize that place, it will find perhaps new species that it will interact with, perhaps new predators or new competitors or new prey. And that will change the shape of the interactions, the networks of interactions, basically. So next, in the sort of list that we're going through of consequences of warming for natural communities is the effects of warming on body size. So the body size of the species, or do not think about this from the perspective of a single individual whose body size is reduced. Like, it's more about the distribution of body sizes of species across communities along large expanses of latitudinal gradients. So for this, we can resort to very well-known, to try to better understand this effect, we can resort to very well-known rules that have been discovered, decades or years ago. Like, for example, the Bergmann's rule that states that warmer regions tend to be inhabited by small-sized species. Then we also have the James's rule, which states that populations with smaller body sizes are more likely to be found in warmer environments. And finally, the allometric size scaling rule that says that warming should lead to a decrease in mean body mass and or a decrease of population abundance at equilibrium. Basically, if we take together these three rules, we can start to make some predictions of hypotheses about what should we expect our communities to look like when it's warmer, basically. So most of the communities that that we have been observing on their change have displayed a general decrease in body size, as it has been shown in studies like, for example, this, both in terrestrial, freshwater, and marine, in which when the temperature surpasses this climb of 20 degrees Celsius, all of the species in general tend to be smaller, right? So, even though for like terrestrial environments, it sometimes go the other way around, in reality, the general trend is that species tend to be smaller. And again, what is the implication of species being smaller for, the structure of these communities? The main thing is that, when you have smaller species, then predators, for example, need to eat more of them to be able to survive, right? So what this is basically what this is doing is sort of altering the equilibrium, or the strengths of the interactions between these species. And as we will see, this can have like profound impacts on ecosystem stability. The last aspect I want to touch on today about warming effects on natural communities and species and single species is the effects on their vital rates. So the vital rates of species includes stuff like, for example, respiration or productivity, which are measurements of metabolism. And here you can see that both respiration and productivity increase as temperature decreases. It is important to see in these plots that on the x-axis, we have actually the inverse of temperature. So anything that goes in this direction, it actually means that it's increasing. And here on the y-axis, we have both respiration and productivity as measures of metabolism. And what these people showed in this study is that both of these things, respiration and productivity, actually go faster as temperature increases. And this is because, you know, the vital rates of all organisms, so everything that they do goes faster in general. So they metabolize everything faster. They live at a faster pace. And this is not only reflected on their respiration or their productivity, as you know, as in metabolism, but it's also reflected on other types of vital rates that are relevant for ecological interactions. Like, for example, the attack rate on the top panel of the right figure. And the attack rate here basically symbolizes how quickly a predator can eat individuals of the prey species. And the handling time has also been shown to be affected by temperature, in this case by decreasing. The handling time is referred to or refers to the amount of time that a predator needs to eat a prey once it has captured it. So how fast they can eat a prey, basically. So as temperature increases, as we can see here, that the handling time decreases, which means that they can eat it faster. So if we take both of these results together, basically what it means is that in warmer communities, or as climate warms, as climate warming progresses, we should expect predators to be able to eat many more prey and in a much faster way, which means that resources will be depleted faster. Predators will probably have less stuff to eat, and this will end up eventually in the extinction of either both the predator and prey, or at least the predator species. So again, here we are seeing evidence of how warming is affecting the very delicate balance of species interactions, and how these effects can actually percolate throughout different trophic levels in the network. So back in 2012, when I was doing my PhD, I sort of collected evidence, like, you know, the three types of evidence that I have been talking to you about until now, and many other from many different sources. And I came up with a framework, for a predictive framework to understand the effect of warming on species interaction networks. And we came up with 7 general rules that we should expect ecosystems to display when they are subjected to warming, like a general reduction in body size across the whole network, a dominance of small species, because small species are more able to live faster than larger species. So, for example, if you think about large species like elephants, you know, their reproduction times are very long, so they are going to have a harder time adapting to a faster way of living. There is a general loss of specialized interactions. This is mainly due to the fact that since species are moving, then they are going to encounter more species and interact with many others. We also, as we saw in the previous slide, interactions are getting stronger because the vital rates between species and, you know, the effects of predator on their prey are going fast. There is, to some degree, some enemy release as prey move. So, for example, if the range shifts is differential between the prey and the predator, there might be situations in which prey actually can escape predators by moving to new places. There is a loss of generalist consumers, and there will be new interactions for generalist consumers as well. So there will be some sort of balance between the, or it has been observed that there is a balance between new interactions, new generalist interactions, and those that have been lost. So Now we are gonna change gears a little bit and think a little bit about what could be the effects of habitat loss, or what has been shown have been the effects of habitat loss on communities. And habitat loss can affect the persistence of a species on local habitat by at least two different mechanisms. One of them is by modifying the local biotic and abiotic conditions. And the other one is, which is also known as fragmentation, is by preventing the dispersal or movement of species or individuals between patches of suitable habitat. And both of these things, either the loss of habitat per se or the fragmentation that it entails, might have different consequences, not only for the persistence of species, but also for the persistence of their interactions. So if we look at on the x-axis on this plot, at the decrease in the strength of the response to habitat loss or fragmentation, and on the y-axis, the survival probability, the first or the strongest response we should expect is that of the abundance of species. And we should expect that common species should be able to survive better, or in other words, we should expect rare species to go extinct due to habitat loss, preferentially, right? Then if we move along the x-axis, the next sort of response in terms of strength that we can expect is the food and nest site preference, or basically how much they are able to eat, or how generalist they are in terms of habitat. And it turns out it is expected that generally species are going to be able to survive better than specialist one. And the last sort of set of responses that we can expect from habitat loss is a change in foraging behavior, or differential responses of species according to their foraging behavior strategies. So for example, long distance foragers are expected to be much more able to cope with habitat loss. So here, if we look at the three top boxes in this plot, basically what we are, or in this figure, basically what we are getting at is the fact that habitat loss, this very insidious type of environmental change, is biasing our communities toward species that are very common, that are generalists, and that are long distance foragers, right? So basically all of these, the other species, rare, specialist, and local, they are expected to get extinct faster. And this will obviously affect the balance of ecosystems, because we will lose not only that evolutionary potential that these species have, but also their ecological role at the ecosystem level. So just to show a few results that have been published in terms of how both reduced area and isolation, so habitat loss per se and fragmentation as a consequence of it, on different aspects of biodiversity. We can expect that habitat loss will reduce species richness and community composition. It will also have some effect on nutrient retention, succession rate, and trophic dynamics. And similarly, fragmentation will obviously affect the movement between fragments, but it also affects the abundance of species, the species persistence, again, retention, pollination, and microclimate. So basically these results, which are actual results from empirical data from communities that were sampled and analyzed, match our predictions from the graph below. Above in the previous slide. Basically what this means is that, again, environmental change is making our communities much more biased towards specific types of species. And obviously ecosystems have been assembled through a long history of ecological and evolutionary dynamics. So affecting this balance is expected to have very strong consequences for ecosystem dynamics. So in terms of the network of ecological interaction, the main sort of effect that we can expect from habitat loss is the breakage of co-occurrence between species, right? So species, in order for species to be able to interact, they need to be together, right? So if I am a predator and my prey is like, miles away or in a different habitat, I won't be able to interact with it, right? So it's easy to see how the fragmentation or loss of habitat can affect the degree to which these species will encounter each other. And the way in which this can happen is basically a two-way interaction between how much habitat has been lost as in the x-axis of the central figure or the central picture of this figure, and on the y-axis how much is the isolation between these patches, how large how far they are apart from each other. So if we go from panel A in this picture, in which all of the patches that remain are relatively big and relatively close to each other, we can expect, as in network A here, a network that is relatively well connected and in which all of the species survive. As we move along the x-axis towards the B panel in this figure, we see that even though the isolation remains the same, so they are still the same distance far from each other, they are way smaller than before, right? So there is an increase in habitat loss. And what this means is that some species, in particular the specialist ones, like for example, these species here, which are also big species, they tend to disappear. So we have a new network in which a particular type of species, the large species in this case, they have disappeared. This is consistent with the with the first figure that we were looking at, in which we can expect large species to disappear faster. Then if we move from A to C along the increased isolation axis, and we go into scenario C, we see that both patches are still the same size, but they are farther from each other. And what this means is that some of the species, like for example, medium-sized species, or in general species that are less able to travel across the different patches, will be lost. And this type of fragmentation will have a different set of consequences on the network. So the species, the important part here is that species that were lost here are not the same as the one that are lost here, which means that depending on the type of environmental change, we should expect different types of responses. And finally, the worst case scenario in which everything becomes smaller and much more farther apart will end up in very, simple networks, simple interactions in which we can expect ecosystems to just totally collapse. So how can we, now that we have all this knowledge about, the effects of warming and the effects of habitat loss on these communities and these interactions, how can we use that and incorporate them into general frameworks that we can use for predicting these effects? So, and this is basically what me and my collaborators, I do here at the Computational Ecology Lab. I try to come up with modeling approaches and also involving analysis of big data sets to basically develop a mechanistic framework to understand how both, or not only habitat loss and warming, but also invasions and other aspects of global change affect communities. And the reason why this is important is because if we want to have any chance at mitigating the effects of the current climate crisis, we need to understand how our actions will, either facilitate or mitigate or do something to these ecosystems, right? So the way in which we do this here in my lab is to try to come up with a comprehensive framework that incorporates knowledge and theories from many different aspects of ecological research into a framework that looks at ecosystems as a network of all species interacting together, like in the top panel of this figure, which is the regional network of all of the interactions, and how habitat filters and the isolation of networks and the dispersal filters affect the shape of these networks at the local spatial scale. So if you imagine that all of this is your regional spatial scale, the entire figure in the bottom panel here, and then you imagine that each of these little patches of green or brown are little habitats, smaller patches of habitats. How does the interplay between interactions and the species that can survive in each of these patches and dispersal among patches actually create a picture of biodiversity, not only in terms of species, but also interactions at the regional scale? And for that, we use theories like, for example, the island biogeography, or more recent models of species distribution, SDMs, species distribution models, to try to understand what is the role of environment and dispersal in determining the local biodiversity of these patches. Then we use concepts borrowed from food web theory, models that predict how the interactions and the dynamics because of these interactions of species in each of the patches will enable persistence and feasibility of these communities at the local patches. And concepts from the metabolic theory of ecology, that the metabolic theory of ecology is basically a way or a framework for understanding the effects of warming on different metabolic pathways or metabolic rates at the local species level. And then at the end, we have species area relationships and meta-community theory as examples of other frameworks, in this case, frameworks relating the size of an area and the number of species it can hold, and meta-community theory, which relates the local population dynamics and the dispersal across patches to better understand how the local community diversity and the dispersal between these patches affects, or how can we use that to predict the effects of fragmentation and warming on these communities. So just to give a little bit of a summary of what we talked about today, we saw that ecological networks are representations of ecosystems as collection of species and their interactions, and that they can actually help us study the structure of biodiversity. So the interesting thing about this is that by having an object that we can quantify, we can actually develop quantitative frameworks to predict what will be the actual quantitative effects of warming, climate warming, or environmental change in the form of habitat loss on these species interactions. We also saw that warming can impact species interaction networks via its effects on species range dynamics, its vital rates and on body size. We also learned that how habitat loss modifies the spatial dynamics of local and regional networks and how that affects ecosystems in general. And as it turns out, I mean, we have always known this, but this is an active research area at the moment, one in which, you know, I am here at the Computational Ecology Lab. I am also looking into is how both habitat loss and warming can at the same time or synergistically affect these communities. And the frameworks like the one that I just explained in the last slide that incorporates many different ecological theories are sort of crucial to develop this understanding. So yeah, I think that this is pretty much it from me. If you are interested in understanding, you know, learning how you can model ecosystems, how you can better understand them from a network perspective, how can you, you know, better study and predict the effects of warming, habitat loss, species invasions, and many other global change drivers. Just, you know, get in touch with me or come here to Swansea and yeah, we can have a go at tackling these challenges together, basically. I will now, I don't know, do you want to say something, Heather, or should I
No,
just?
I was going to say thank you very much. We've already had one question come through, so please feel free. To send them through either on the Q&A or on the chat.
Yeah.
So yeah, we do have one question. So the first question is, does isolation have a bigger effect than habitat loss? And is that why some cities are very biodiverse, small pockets of habitats, but quite close together?
Yeah. So yeah, as that is a very good question, and I think that you know, the main thing to realize here is that when you have different pockets or small pockets in a city, the main problem there is not so much, I think personally, is not so much how well connected they are, but sorry, how big they are, but how easy it is for a species to move across this, right? Because if a species gets lost or gets extinct in one of these small pockets, then the question is whether that species will be able to recolonize that pocket from an adjacent patch of habitat. So the question about whether isolation have a bigger effect than habitat loss, it's, you know, it's a hard, I think that both of those things have an effect, as I showed in one of the slides, and whether the effect is bigger or not is a matter of exactly what aspect of biodiversity you are interested in. So I would say that isolation would be very important for species that have adapted to move a lot to find resources, whereas the extent of the habitat that has been lost, so that the area of habitat loss would be more relevant for species that are big. So bigger species tend to need, they need larger patches of habitat. So it's, yeah, again, it's a trade-off between the traits of species and the aspect of biodiversity that you are interested in. And why some cities are more biodiverse? Yeah, I think that, you know, that question is, it's very idiosyncratic. You know, that there are different cities might be more biodiverse because of different things. So obviously a city in the tropic, even though it's big, like for example, Sao Paulo, might be way more biodiverse than London, but that is only because, you know, by its geographical location, it's already more biodiverse, right? So the question would be whether cities that can be considered relatively similar in terms of climatic conditions and other aspects, like, for example, pollution or the level of urban development, whether they are whether one of them is more biodiverse than other. And I would say that probably not. So yeah.
So the next question is one I can answer. So it's they've said they've missed another one of the climate crisis webinars. I will put a link to all of our webinar kind of series recordings. So once this is finished, obviously we're recording it now, we will then put it up on the website. So if you check on this link that I've just posted in the chat, sometime next week, hopefully, and there's also a range of other webinars that have taken place. You can search by courses and things like that as well. We then do have another kind of topic-based question. So Avijit, is isolation the main reason for extinction of animals in every decade?
The main reason for extinction of animals in every decade. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that, but yeah, isolation is one of the causes of extinction. I wouldn't say it is the main cause of extinction. So it mainly impacts species that have already small population sizes. So animals that are already rare, they will be even further impacted by isolation, because they will find it hard to move to other patches that might also be suitable, and then like found new populations there. So I think that again, I cannot say if isolation is the main reason for extinction, but it's definitely a reason for extinction, especially for small animals, for small species. Yeah. So we have another question. You mentioned that because predators metabolize their prey quicker. Well, technically they don't metabolize their prey. So metabolism is the rate at which different functions happen inside bodies. Like, for example, you know, how fast the cells metabolize a particular sort of protein or compound. So it's not predators, they don't really metabolize, they attack their prey and they eat it basically. But anyway, predators metabolize their prey quicker in warm environments. The prey resource is used up, leading to predator death. Yeah, so sometimes when in food webs or in predator-prey interactions, when the predator uses up all of the prey, they can lead up to, or when several predators are attacking the same prey, they can lead up to their own extinction. Rate of photosynthesis also increases in warmer temperatures. So would there not also be more plants for prey to eat, meaning prey can grow more quickly and therefore the prey does not run out? Okay, now I see the point you're trying to make. So basically the degree to which, I mean, which one of the trophic levels will go extinct first will depend on whether each of the species can catch up with the increase of in the attack of the consumer to their resource relative to the next trophic level. So for example, if, as you are saying, if the plants also increase their productivity and they can grow faster, then you would expect the herbivores to increase also in numbers, and then the predators to have enough food, which is basically what you are suggesting in your question, right? But you know, the reproduction events or the reproduction time of the herbivores might be not as fast as what the predators can eat. So it's all it's all a matter of balance between whether the increase in the rate of a particular interaction or the strength of an interaction can be actually subsidized or maintained by the increase in another trophic level. So in the case of herbivores versus top predators, there are instances in which this is the case, in which prey can keep multiplying or keep reproducing to enable the predator to survive. But in some instances that doesn't happen. So it depends on the ecosystem that you are looking at, basically. So the next question says, what applications do you think engineering could have in improving damaged ecosystems? Oof, that's a hard question. I think that's probably more relevant for one of our other webinars, but I'll try to give an answer here. So I think that the main problem is that humans will always need more land to destroy, because we will always need to build more things. So I guess that if you as an engineer come up with a better, with a more clever or efficient use of space, that will prevent people from wanting to destroy more space than what they need. And that will mean less habitat loss, less habitat fragmentation, and therefore healthier ecosystems. Cool. So Joshua has another question. Is marine biodiversity affected in the same way as land-based organisms by global warming? I'm assuming more persisting organisms such as sharks, which have previously survived extinction, will still be able to survive. However, could the possible lack of prey cause their extinction, population loss, smaller body size? So actually, it is interesting that you bring sharks as an example to your question, because, well, first of all, yes, marine biodiversity is being affected in the same way, and in some instances, even more than land biodiversity by global warming, mainly because warming, on top of affecting, body size distributions and vital rates and all that, it's also affecting a very important part of the marine ecosystem, which is the substrate, the corals, right? So coral reefs are affected by an entire other set of mechanisms by global warming. So that's that adds to the whole sort of impacts, basically. So in the case of sharks, for example, they depend on, many species of shark depend on healthy ecosystems, like, for example, coral reef sharks. So even though, as you say, they probably have survived previous extinction events, I think that it is very possible that at the rate at which coral reefs are being lost and other marine habitats, even species as sharks will get extinct at some point. And I don't really have the numbers with me right now, but I wouldn't be surprised if there are some species of sharks that have already gotten extinct. So yeah. So another question is, are ecosystems in particular biomes being affected? Oof, yeah, I guess that's an interesting question, but I don't really have the answer for that. I don't really know. I don't know if, I would guess that people have looked into this. So it might be worth having a browse in the literature for the differential effects of environmental change on different biomes. From the knowledge that we gathered today in today's talk, I would probably guess that biomes that are, more susceptible to, in which species have been less exposed to warming, like for example, the poles, will be more affected. So I would expect like Antarctic or Arctic biomes to be more affected by this, but I don't really, I am not putting my hands in the fire for this because I don't really have hard evidence, but based on what I know and these previous studies, I would say that is the case. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think we've got through about 7 questions there, so thank you very much for engaging. Always good to end on one that kind of causes a little bit the academics be a bit stumped because it's outside of their area, so it's always nice to see people thinking more broadly. So thank you very much for joining us. As I said, this recording will be available online, so if you do think you want to share it with anyone, or someone you know wanted to join but was unable to, then you can, or if you'd like to look back at some of the kind of engineering and climate crisis ones, for example, then you can do so as well. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Cool. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Joshua, Anna, Daniel. Thank you, Sophie.
All right, goodbye.